friends reunited to the Agrarian Change seminar of this week. So welcome to this Agrarian Change seminar. I'm Jens Lerche from SOAS, University of London, and I'll be chairing this session in which Vikas Rawal will present and discuss farmers' resistance to neoliberalism with a focus on the protest against the new farm laws in India. This is a topic that is all the more pertinent as these protests, which have been labeled the largest organized strike in the history of the world, are still ongoing. Those who listened in earlier would have heard that Vikas were actually visiting the protest site earlier today, just to make the point. I'm also joined by two co-organizers, Sreya Senha from the University of Cambridge and Enrique Castagnon here from SOAS. The Agrarian Change seminar series is organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change and the Department of Development Studies at SOAS. The seminars are now run as webinars, and you can find the full program of the series on our website, Agrarian Questions. The webinar is also live streamed on YouTube. And before we start, we have the usual guidelines for participants. Please keep your microphone off, except when taking part in the discussion. And the webinar is interactive, so do go ahead and write questions and comments in the chat at any point in time. This is also the case for those of you that have joined us through our YouTube live stream. There's a chat function there too. In addition to that, in the question and answer session that follows the presentation, those in the webinar can ask questions, can also ask live questions. Simply use the raised hand function. You will find this function if you click on the participant button. And of course, when asking a question or making a comment, please be considerate and respectful. Finally, we're going to record both the audio and the video of the session. So if you do not wish to be recorded, simply don't use the audio and video. It is now time to welcome today's speaker, Vikas Rawal from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, where he is Professor of Economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning. His main research interests are in the area of food and agriculture. He has undertaken field-based studies across many states of India and large-scale macro-level studies for India. And he also works on global issues in the area of food and agriculture. Vikas has also been a senior consultant at the FAO, and he has published widely in academic journals, including in the Journal of Agrarian Change. His recent books include the co-authored book, Ending Malnutrition from Commitment to Action, and an edited volume on the global economy of pulses, both published by the FAO. So it's a pleasure, it is with pleasure that I welcome Vikas Rawal and his presentation on farmers resist neoliberalism, protest against the farm laws in India. And because we should also, as is fairly obvious maybe for some of us, we'll also thank you for taking time out at this late time of the evening in Delhi. It must be close to midnight there now. So that's of course the downside of doing global workshops or seminars, but thanks a lot. And you have the next 50 minutes, up to 50 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Jens, and thanks everybody thanks for inviting me to be part of this series, and thanks everybody for coming. It's a pleasure to speak to a lot of friends I see here, and I suppose a lot of to-be friends. So thank you very much, and I'm so let me just start without wasting time. Let me first share my screen. All right. Let me first start by giving you an overview of what these new farm laws are, against which farmers are protesting, and then I'll try and explain what these farm laws are about and why farmers are protesting against them. There are essentially three main laws. The three laws deal with deregulation of agricultural marketing. The new law is called Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Act. The second law deals with contract farming. It essentially provides a national sort of legislative framework under which contract farming has to happen. This law has a long name, Farmers Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Act. And the third law deals with regulation of food supply and stockholding. It's an amendment of an old 1955 act called the Essential Commodities Act, and the new act is called Essential Commodities Amendment Act. In addition to these three main contentious farm laws, there are two other laws which are on the anvil. On October 28th, an ordinance, I'll explain them in a little while what ordinances are. They're essentially emergency provisions for creating laws which have to be passed in the parliament within a period of 6 months. So an ordinance was approved to set up a commission for management of air quality in the National Capital region. This ordinance has stringent penal provisions for farmers in neighboring states of the National Capital region who burn crop stubble. In addition, government has proposed a bill to amend the Electricity Act of 2003. This amendment proposes to essentially end the system of subsidies for electricity, and that would result in an increased cost of electricity for agriculture in many states. So this is the framework of legal reform changes that have been taken place or are on the anvil, which have become bones of contention. Before I go on to discuss these in greater detail, I would like to talk about a little bit about the first the historical context of the first law, that is the law related to deregulation of agricultural marketing. This is essentially about deregulation reform of a system of regulated agricultural markets. This system of regulated agricultural markets was introduced first in India in the 1930s, and it was expanded to almost all Indian states after independence, essentially to protect farmers from exploitation by traders, to ensure that they receive remunerative prices, and to ensure that they receive timely payments. Now, as per the seventh schedule of the Indian Constitution, powers for making laws related to agriculture are reserved specifically for the state governments. The national government does not make laws related to agriculture. Consequently, as part of this framework of the overall framework of national planning, these laws, the laws that created the regulated markets, these laws are called the Agriculture Produce Market Committee Acts. APMC Acts is the short form. These APMC Acts were passed by the state governments, state assemblies, state legislative assemblies in the 1950s and 1960s. So these are state level laws. Each state, most of the states have an APMC Act. Now, in the 1970s and 80s, there was a huge, very significant growth in establishment of regulated markets under these acts. So these acts, the basic let's say core framework of these acts, there is considerable diversity across states in what these acts do, but the basic framework is as follows. Under these acts, the state governments notify a certain place to be an agricultural market. In that market, a market yard is established, and a certain area around that, in Punjab, for example, it's a roughly 5 kilometer radius. A certain area around that yard is notified as an agricultural mandi, an agriculture market, and all agricultural produce in that area has to be sold in that market yard, and as per the provisions and regulations established by this market committee. So a committee is established for each market yard. That committee has representatives of farmers, of traders, of various kinds of stakeholders, state government. And this committee essentially sets rules as to how the transactions would happen. So, for example, the produce has to be auctioned, what would be the commission paid to commission agents, what would be the charges for weighing, loading, unloading, packing, and so on and so forth. So that entire system of how the transactions would happen is regulated through rules set up by this market committee. And the APMC Act's mandate that any transaction that has to happen in the notified market must happen as per rules set up by this committee. Now, between 1970s and 80s, as you can see, there's a very significant growth in the number of markets that were established. Between 1968 and 1990, the number increased from about 1,610 to 6,640. Now, in the post-liberalization period, that is post 1991, you find that this public investment in agricultural marketing declines. And over the last 15 years, 25 years, the more regulated markets have been closed than the new markets have been created. Now, while these markets were created with the objective of ending exploitation of farmers at, at in the markets, this has not always been the case, and various problems have persisted in the functioning of these markets. These include, for example, collusion and cartelization among traders and commission agents, interlocking of transactions, poor infrastructure in many regulated markets, and so on. uh, Let me also mention that while I've not put the data here on the presentation, there is a considerable diversity in the density of these markets across different states. There was a major national commission called the Swaminathan Commission, which had recommended that there should be a regulated market established for every 80 square kilometers. No state has met that norm. The best is Punjab, where there is a market for roughly 150 square kilometers. But in most states of India, there is the average area per market is in excess of 500 square kilometers. So in large parts of the country, there simply aren't enough regulated markets, which means that for a vast majority of farmers, they simply don't have access to regulated markets, which means that now outside the area mandated by the act, there is no regulation. So most farmers end up selling their produce to individual traders in open markets, in periodic markets, traders here and there, or village level traders where no regulations apply. So the whole system of regulation only applies to markets which have been notified, which are far and few. Now, let me just sort of say a little bit about the history of deregulation of agricultural market. This has been a process that's been going on for about 20 years now. The first committee that recommended deregulation of agricultural marketing was in 2001, called the Shankar Lal Guru Committee, which said, I just have one key quote from the report of that committee, which says, alternative marketing systems need to be developed in the country to promote direct marketing, smooth raw material supplies to agro-processing industries, competitive trading, organized retailing, information exchange, and adoption of innovative marketing systems and technologies. In 2002, a task force was established to implement the recommendations of this committee. And this task force said, in order to encourage the private sector to make massive investments required for development of alternative marketing infrastructure and supporting services, provisions of the APMC Acts would need modification to create a lawful role for the private sector in market development. Government's role should be that of a facilitator rather than that of having control over the management of markets. In 2003, a model state agriculture models, let's say a model APMC Act is produced. Now, you see, this is a period. There are two things that would like to mention about this period. One is that this is a period in which the first BJP government is in power, and this the reform of agricultural markets has really been pioneered by BJP. BJP governments have really been the ones who've been most aggressive about this. Uh, that's the second thing I want to mention, is that throughout this period, since 2000 until in fact May 2020, all that was said about reform of agricultural markets, the framework was that these APMC acts are state level acts. Under the 7th schedule of the Constitution, laws related to agriculture must be made at the state level, and therefore the central government only prepared model acts and advised, in some cases, tried to coerce state governments to adopt these acts. But the laws have to be created by state governments and not by the central government. Central government can only create model acts, can make recommendations, can somehow try to get the state governments to do it, but finally the laws have to be created at the state level. This was the understanding throughout. Now, in 2003, as I said, a model APMC, the first model APMC Act was created by the central government, and then there is a bit of a lull between 2003 and 2016, when the second NDA government is formed in 2014. During that period, basically the efforts were to get the states to bring some reforms in their APMC Act. The Congress government, the UPA government that was in power between 2004 and 2014 was committed to agricultural reform, but basically tried to get states to do reforms at their level. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. But before that, in 2016, the government set up an electronic platform for a national agricultural market. The platform really did not take off because the logistics and the supporting infrastructure that was required for it never materialized. And of course, the farmers were, not obviously did not have the wherewithal or capacity to trade their produce electronically. So bulk of the produce did simply happen, got sold the way it always did. In 2017, this government came out with a new model act, which has sort of even more sort of aggressive provisions for liberalization of agricultural marketing. In 2020, an important change happens. This is in January 2020. The 15th Finance Commission introduces what are called performance-based grants. This required that the states will have to implement the 2017 Model Act to become eligible to avail the performance-based grants awarded by the Finance Commission from 2021-22. So they basically made availing grants that are constitutionally mandated by the central government, the grants that the central government has to give to state governments. These were made contingent on states implementing these model acts. Okay. Now the central government is coercing the states, but even in January 2020, the understanding is that the laws have to be made by the state governments. In the months of April and May, when we were having the COVID pandemic lockdown, several spokespersons of the government, including the agriculture minister and the finance minister, make announcements that this is the golden opportunity given to us by the pandemic and the states should reform their APMC acts. So even in May, the finance minister makes the announcement that the reform should be brought about by the states. And then something flips in June, and on 5th of June, the central government decides that they cannot go on waiting for the states to do it. This opportunity cannot be missed, and they decide that they're going to bring in national level acts, and the central government is going to do it. And that was a big change that happens in the month of June. But before we talk about these laws, let me also mention that this period between 2003 and 2014, and to some extent also from 2014 to 2020, has been in fact a period in which several states have introduced different aspects of these kinds of reform. Deregulation and reforms of APMC Act had indeed happened. And this map shows different periods, different kinds of reforms. These included, for example, giving unified licenses to traders. That is, the traders who are licensed to buy produce in one market in the state can buy it in any market in the state. Single point levy of market fees, direct marketing, deregulation of marketing of fruits and vegetables, and so on. So several provisions of what was the larger agenda of agricultural market reforms was in fact already introduced by the states. And there is therefore a genuine question that if so many states had in fact introduced these various aspects of reforms, what was the need to bring about this one-size-fit-all national laws? Now, In April and May, as I said, the central government tried to get the state governments to introduce ordinances and laws to adopt the Model Acts. But in June, it decides that there is an entry 33 in the concurrent list of the seventh schedule of the Constitution, which can be interpreted to include all agriculture. It's an entry that was originally introduced in the 1960s to or late 50s, sorry, I'm getting the year wrong, uh, to essentially uh, uh, allow the central government to create laws related to interstate trade. But it's an entry which is rather loosely formulated in the Constitution, but it has never been interpreted to imply that agricultural laws can be made by the central government. And it's the first time that in the month of June, government decides that this entry can be used in this manner. The three laws were first introduced in June as ordinances. Ordinances, as I said, are provisions in the Constitution for emergency situations where legislative changes cannot wait for the next session of the parliament. And obviously, there's no such emergency in the context of these laws. And the fact that, we were in the middle of a lockdown, in the middle of a pandemic of the kind that the world has seen. In September, still in the middle of the COVID pandemic, the monsoon session of the parliament was called to pass these bills. Okay, so the parliament sits for a few days in the month of September to pass these bills, and they become acts subsequently. It's important to note that in December, the government declared that the winter session of parliament could not be called because of the pandemic. But in September, they decided to hold the session. The bills were declared passed without voting in the upper house, the Rajya Sabha, where the government does not have a majority. So, there's every chance that the bills would have not passed in the upper house, but they simply did not have any voting. One of its oldest allies, the Akali Dal of Punjab, had quit the government opposing the bills. So this is how the bills were passed. Before I go on to discuss what is contentious in these bills and how these protests have unfolded, let me just briefly talk about some directions of agrarian change over the last few years to then sort of set the stage to explain why farmers are opposing these laws. Over the last 3 decades, we have seen uh, decline in public support to agriculture in various forms. Deregulation of input prices and increasing cost of production are one result of that. I have put together one sort of collection of some graphs here. This one shows how the fertilizer prices have shot up post 2010 2011, when the nutrient based subsidy regime was introduced for all fertilizers except urea. The urea prices have been flat, but everything else has shot up. Really, there's been a huge increase in prices of fertilizer. This is diesel prices. From what was in 2017, there's been a massive increase in diesel prices. Diesel prices used to be below the world crude prices index. They have gone way above the world crude price index. The insurance is another story. Insurance has been privatized after 2016. You have a huge amount of money that's being pumped, that's just being handed out to insurance companies, and very little claims are being given to farmers. So claim to premium ratio has fallen drastically in case of agriculture. Now, so essentially you have a situation where various kinds of public support, whether it's subsidies for inputs, insurance, prices of diesel, and so on. You've basically seen a very significant withdrawal of that support for farmers. Uh, Deregulation, privatization, withdrawal of public support have resulted in an increase in cost of production. On the other hand, low global food prices and low trade barriers tend to put downward pressure on open market prices in most agricultural commodities. This has meant that farmers who have access to the public procurement system, which covers only rice and wheat, and basically covers only rice and wheat, and is carried out only in some states, such farmers sell the crop to government agencies. In states like Punjab and Haryana, area under cotton cultivation has shrunk, while farmers have little choice other than growing rice and wheat because that's what the government procures. And almost all of wheat and rice in these states is sold to government agencies because the open market prices are now too low. They're just too low to cover the cost. And I'll show you some data. Farmers, on the other hand, farmers who do not have access to the public procurement system, which is a vast majority of farmers, that is farmers who do not grow rice and wheat, and farmers in states where systems of public procurement are not functional, such farmers are left at the mercy of private merchants and open markets in which prices are extremely volatile and very often much below the cost of production. This table, I've just put together some data on returns that farmers get per hectare over cost. And this is A2 plus FL is essentially the paid out cost that the farmers have. This is that is inputs that the farmers purchase plus the family labor, the value of the labor that they put, their own family labor. C2 is the total cost. It includes the rental value of their own land in addition to A2 plus FL. But you can see if you look at the crops, in case of rice, I mean, a farmer having 1 hectare of land, and mind you, the average landholding of an Indian farmer is half a hectare, over a period of say 4 months of rice gets only 3,200 rupees. Okay, that's 75 rupees to a dollar. Okay, that's the income that return that a farmer gets from average return that a farmer gets from growing paddy. In case of maize, the average return is just about 1,000 rupees. That's about what, $15, $15 for a maize crop per hectare. That's so the returns from various crops are just very, very low. These show you what percent of farmers actually do not recover their cost. And it's just incredible. 82% of 83% of rice growers do not recover the cost C2. 85% of maize growers do not recover their cost C2. It's only in wheat that 30% of them do. But look at this is green gram. 94% of farmers incur losses. 93% of farmers growing black gram incur losses. 85% of farmers growing cotton incur losses. So it's just incredible how Indian farmers, if you take into account all the cost, that is the value of their labor, value of their machinery, value of their land, actually just incur losses. The prices they get from the market simply do not recover their cover even their cost. Leave aside the returns over that cost. Now, this essentially summarizes the nature of crisis. Now, while on the one hand you have this crisis, farmers who have access to the public procurement system therefore sell their rice and wheat to government agencies. Now, while on the and that is the reason why government procurement, on the other hand, has actually increased. Now, while government procurement has increased, government has resisted expanding the public distribution system beyond the mandate of 2013 National Food Security Act, resulting in a massive accumulation of stocks. Now, in June 2020, India had over 100 million tons of food grain. This is a historic record. India has never had such a high stock of food grain. This is public stock of food grain, was 100 million tons. These stocks could have been used to alleviate distress during the COVID pandemic, but the government has been rather miserly. And you actually realize that now in January 2021, on 1st January 2021, the public stock of grain were higher than they were on 1st January 2020. So on one hand, farmers are being forced to sell to the government because that's the only way you can get some returns. That is, farmers who produce wheat and rice and who have access to public procurement sell it to the government. Government does not dispose it off through the public distribution system and accumulates the stock. And because you've accumulated such a large amount of stocks, private traders bring down the prices. So in states where government is not procuring, the open market prices have essentially crashed. And India's, in fact, I've not put it on the slide, but India, it's a very peculiar situation. Farmers in states like Bihar and West Bengal are selling rice at such low prices that India has emerged as one of the major exporters of rice, beating Vietnam and Thailand, and selling rice to Southeast Asian countries. Large rice has emerged as one of the largest export commodities because Indian farmers are selling it cheap to traders who are then exporting it. Maintaining such large stocks has meant a considerable fiscal burden on the government, a situation that is obviously an anathema to a neoliberal state. India's system of public procurement and agricultural subsidies have been under attack from developed countries at the WTO. In absence to an immediate solution to the problem, over the last few years, government has simply moved these losses, the losses of the Food Corporation of India, off its budget by forcing it to borrow to meet its expenses rather than directly provisioning it as has always been the practice. In December 31, FCI, on December 31, 2020, FCI had a debt of rupees 3,743 billion, which was more than 4 times higher than the debt 4 years ago. In 4 years, FCI's debt has gone 4 times. So basically, you've turned a major public sector enterprise, which is critical for India's food security and food system, in burdened with a massive mountain of debt. Now, why are farmers protesting? The laws, what are the contentious provisions of these farm laws? Firstly, and that's in my view one of the most important problems, the laws create an uneven playing field between regulated markets and sales happening outside these markets. The sales, so the first law, which deregulates agricultural markets, essentially says that now agricultural produce can be sold outside the market yard, and no regulations would apply outside the market yard, and the state has no powers to impose any tax. The state governments are not allowed to impose any taxes and cesses on sales that happen outside the market yard. So obviously, the traders would shift all trade to outside the market yard because they don't have to pay taxes on it. State governments cannot register or impose any licensing requirements on traders. They've already, in fact, over the last few months, there have already been cases of traders who vanished after purchasing the produce, and farmers have found that the checks have just bounced. The dispute settlement mechanisms of these laws place farmers in extremely weak position. Elected village panchayats, the village councils, or elected representatives of people have no role in settling disputes between the traders and the farmers, or the companies with whom the farmers enter into contract farming agreements. Farmers organizations cannot provide any support to farmers, and key powers have basically been given to bureaucracy. So the companies have the dispute settlement mechanism essentially relies on representatives of these companies or traders and these bureaucracies, and if they collude, then the farmers have no hope. In fact, an unprecedented feature of these laws is also that they bar farmers from going to civil courts. This is the first time that laws have such provisions that the farmers cannot approach civil courts for redressal of their complaints. The state governments cannot regulate contract farming agreements. Terms of contract farming agreements include prices at which the prices are outside all regulations, and can only be mutually decided between the companies and the farmers. And there's nothing to prevent that the prices are set at levels which are below what are called the minimum support prices set by the government. The system of public procurement critically depends on regulated markets. So it's only in the regulated markets or the sub-markets or procurement centers set up by regulated markets that farmers sell to government agencies. And I've just explained how public procurement has become increasingly more important. Farmers, the only way you can get some return from agriculture is if you have the choice of selling it to the government agencies, and government agencies procure in the regulated markets. So if the trade moves out of regulated markets lose business, regulated markets would basically not be able to maintain themselves, have money to further upkeep and upgradation, you would basically have a situation where these regulated markets would basically sort of you know be destroyed, and eventually the whole system of public procurement would therefore collapse. So the intention, now the fact that the public procurement has become a fiscal burden, and the burden that a neoliberal state would not like to take, is clearly the most important intention behind this direction of reform that has been introduced through these acts. Now, what is the and now coming to the protests themselves. The protests erupted across the country soon after the ordinances were brought about. In the first week itself, protest demonstrations took place in thousands of places, and copies of these ordinances were burned. Millions of people participated in protests across the country on August 9th, the anniversary of Quit India movement, which was a major episode in the independence movement for India, and on 5th of September. September 25th, where after the bills were passed in the parliament, was called the Resistance Day. And on this day, protest actions were organized across the country. Many towns and cities of Haryana and Punjab, two states which have the best systems of public procurement and therefore are obviously feeling the most threatened by these laws, saw a complete shutdown. Protest actions across the country were organized on October 2nd, which is the birthday of Mahatma Gandhi. The social and on this day, social boycott of members and supporters of ruling parties was done in many of these states. And then October 14th was celebrated as the right to minimum support prices. Over the next 2 months, various kinds of protest actions were organized. These included blocking of roads, blocking of railways in many places. In Haryana, senior members of BJP governments were out, shown black flags, and prevented from entering into their constituencies. On November 26th, there was a call to come to Delhi. And in days before November 26th, the government in Haryana, the state government, which is a BJP government, and Haryana lies between Punjab and Delhi, barricaded all roads, imposed curfew, and arrested a large number of peasant leaders. Major highways towards Delhi had unprecedented police deployment. The roads were barricaded with concrete boulders and trucks filled with sand. And in many cases, actually, roads were just dug. So they just dug, very deep sort of trenches on the roads to prevent farmers from crossing the barricades. But on November 26th, farmers breached all these barricades. They braved tear gas shells, water cannons, police batons, and drove their tractors right through them. So you just had thousands of tractors from all sides descending on Delhi. And I've put a few photographs to show the scenes from November 26th. Once the barricades were broken, farmers were further enthused, and over the coming weeks, number of farmers at these borders swelled. I've put a map, which is a Google map image from last evening, and all the red points that you see here are where the farmers are protesting. So this is Delhi, and surrounding Delhi, this is the biggest protest. This is called the Singhu border. This is the Grand Trunk Road National Highway, which is completely blocked now for last 2 months. This is Tikri border, the second biggest protest, and this again is a major highway which has been blocked. This is the highway that goes to Jaipur towards the south, and this is where I was this morning. This is Shahjahanpur, the farthest blockade, but again, the highway has been completely blocked. This is Palwal, this is Ghazipur. So 6 major entry points to Delhi have been blocked by farmers for last 6 months with their tractor trolleys, and they've set up these massive camps. As harvesting completed in Western UP, the farmers from Western UP came and set up camp here. After Panchayat elections got over in Rajasthan, farmers from Rajasthan came and camped here. A contingent then comes from Maharashtra, from Madhya Pradesh, and now also from Tamil Nadu and Kerala. A fairly substantial contingent from Kerala is now protesting here. So you now I mean, what started as protest on the borders of Delhi by farmers from Punjab and Haryana now clearly has a national character. Now there are farmers from various states of India protesting in Delhi, and along with this, protests continue in the state capitals. What has also happened over the last, well, in fact, over the first few weeks after the farmers arrived at the borders of Delhi, that this Sanyukt Kisan Morcha, the Joint Farmers Front, took a concrete form. And that group has been negotiating with the government. The last round of talks with the government was yesterday. Uh, there has also been a massive swelling of social support, in particular in Punjab and Haryana. I mean, in fact, uh, I mean, I would have to take a separate lecture if I had to talk about the extent of social support that has the upheaval and the kind of social sentiments that have been that have sort of been expressed in Punjab. Trade unions have come out in support, women's organizations have come out in support, and artists. There's been a tsunami of artistic productions in solidarity with struggles. I have, in fact, been archiving songs created in solidarity with this struggle, this farmer struggle over the last few months. And there are 650 songs as of today in my archive. I've put a link here for people who might be interested. There are all sorts of songs, some absolutely brilliant music that has been created in solidarity with these farmers, particularly in Punjabi, and it's really very, very interesting. The protests are being supported by a large umbrella of philanthropic organizations, and in particular Sikh religious institutions, which are running constant langar, is a form of religious feeding, and services of all kinds. And I put some images of massive community kitchens that have been set up at Singhu and Tikri borders. It's in fact quite incredible. I mean, it's an incredible celebration and festivity going on at these borders as farmers protest. Uh, an unfortunate thing is also that given the extreme winter when these protests erupted, uh, Delhi had really sort of terrible cold when these farmers first arrived. Over 100 farmers have lost their lives due to hypothermia, cardiac arrest, suicides, accidents of people going back and forth from their villages and states, and other sicknesses. Despite that, the mobilization has continued. There is now a call for a Kisan parade on 26th of January, which is the Republic Day. This is one of the most important national official ceremonies. In Delhi, there is an official parade, but the farmers have given a call for doing a tractor march around surrounding a ring road, which is a road that surrounds Delhi. So there is a massive scale of mobilization going on right now, particularly in Punjab and Haryana, but also in many other states, to mobilize farmers to come in their tractors on 26th, in the days sort of in the next few days, actually over the next 4 or 5 days, you're going to see a massive swelling of tractors in around on the borders. And on 26th of January in the afternoon, these tractors would march into Delhi. January 23rd to 25th, there is a call for sit-ins at the offices of governors of all states. And January 26th, Kisan parades in all state capitals, along with the Kisan parade in the national capital. There have been 10 rounds of talks between the government and representatives of farmers. Government has so far refused to budge and has not accepted the key demands for repealing the three laws. The farmers are demanding that the laws should be repealed, and the farmers are demanding that the minimum support price should be made a statutory right. Government has made some vague proposals which have been rejected by the farmers. Government first offered to make a committee with representative of farmers, which was rejected. Then the government accepted that, okay, there are some flaws in the laws and we'll make amendments. But they neither gave any specific details about the amendments, or sort of made it clear that and it was also clear that the amendments they were talking about were far from sufficient, in terms of addressing the concerns that farmers had. So I mean, that was also a proposal that was rejected. Yes, government has expressed its willingness to remove the penal provision from the ordinance on air quality management in the NCR region for stubble burning, and withdraw the bill on electricity, or withdraw not the bill on electricity reforms, but withdraw the provisions related to agricultural subsidies in the bill. In between, the Supreme Court decided to intervene because the government had approached the Supreme Court. Farmers have been very clear. They do not want to go to the court because their view is that the laws have been created by the government and the laws can only be repealed by the government. It is not the job of the courts to decide what laws are good for people or not. The Supreme Court, however, formed a committee of experts to provide views to the court and ordered the farmer union to talk to the committee. It stayed implementation of laws until the committee submits its report. But all the experts on the committee are people who publicly supported the laws, and at least one of them is a key architect of these reforms. The farmers front has rejected the committee and has refused to talk to the committee. In the last round of talks that was held yesterday, government has offered to suspend implementation of the laws for 18 months, and Sanयुkt Kisan Morcha has today, in fact, rejected that proposal as well, saying that we would not return unless the laws are repealed. Phase 3 of the protest starts on January 26th. We don't know what will actually happen on January 26th. Farmers have declared that they will enter Delhi on January 26th, which is the Republic Day. Farmers are going to hold the Kisan Parade, as I said, in the afternoon. And one expects that hundreds of thousands of tractors and millions of farmers will be in Delhi to make their demands. Farmers are determined that they will not return until these laws are repealed. The scale of mobilization is absolutely unprecedented. There is no doubt that we have not seen, well, at least I have not seen, not only farmers' protest of this scale, but any protest of this scale in India. Farmers are prepared for a long haul, knowing that bending this government is not going to be easy. But there is no doubt that whatever course this struggle takes, this is absolutely an extremely important event, if not the most important event that we've seen in the recent history of Indian democracy. So let me stop with this and we can discuss. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much, Vikas. That was, of course, as expected, a really interesting outline of both the government policies over the years that have taken us to where we are now, of the conditions of the farming group per se in general, and of the protests, yeah, hugely interesting. And I mean, as you say, it is quite extraordinary that Delhi can be remained so, if not locked down, then at least cut off from parts of the rest of the country through the blockages, that can go on for so many months. We have seen how the Indian government have cracked down on protests before, very heavy-handedly. And obviously, they're not doing this yet for this protest. And that is hugely interesting. It both speaks to the strengths of the protest, but also maybe of who are doing the protests. Now, I could raise a number of questions to you, but normally I would do that, but I know Jan Bremen is not here for very long. So Jan, and I know you have some comments. So if you would like to kickstart the question and answer session, then I will hand over to you in a minute. But just to repeat to everyone that questions can be put by raising the hand, not physically, but via the system here. Click on participant, and then you can see how you raise your hand. And you can also communicate questions through the chat here, and also those that are following through the live stream YouTube. There's a chat functioning there too, and we will monitor that and return to that as well. But But let's start, Jan Bremen, if you'd like to, over to you. You are still mute, yeah.
I am audible now.
Yes.
Very good. And congratulations with organizing this event. We are at the sideline, so to say, what's happening in India today and in the coming weekend when this Kisan Sunset is going on is very important, of course. And I'm on two minds. I'm as thrilled as all of us are about this protest movement. A protest against a dictate by the current set of powermongers in India, who push this through parliament on majoritarianism rule, and saying this is in the national interest, and accusing those who stand up against it as being anti-national. That's a common ploy that has been used again and again, and now also. So I'm as thrilled as you are with this protest, and I wish it well. But I have a sobering note. The sobering note is that I don't think that the protest is being organized by the farming class. This farming class who has organized it, and quite successfully so, for half a year now, for a resistance movement for 6 months. You have not only, you need not only courage to do that, you need also leverage to do it. And the leverage is that this is a dominating section, a land-owning class, which owns the majority of arable land. And we don't hear much about the other classes, agrarian classes, down below, least of all about landless labor. And we know, when we read the press, that, for instance, agricultural labor, or the laboring classes, let me put it in that fashion, the laboring classes in Haryana and Punjab are not very strong, don't have a very strong opinion on supporting this movement. They have been exploited not only for the last 10 years, a couple of decades, but from generation to generation, they have been exploited by the farmers who are now protesting about being exploited by the state. And we don't hear much about that class interest, the divided class interest in the rural economy. And they are very important, of course. Jens, I don't know if I quote you correctly, but you said this is the largest protest movement, agrarian protest movement in the country ever. That largest protest movement has been announced a couple of months ago by the working classes of India, when they said that they would go on strike on the end of November, on 26 November, the biggest strike ever, not only in the country, in the world at large. And it totally fizzled out. We didn't read much about, we didn't hear much about the failure of that strike. And that shows the difference between those who have clout, who have power locally, to go to the national scene and protest. They may be successful, but let's look at the underside. Let's look at the ugly side and see how these same farmers have exploited first local labor, and then increasingly substituting local labor by outside labor, by migrant labor, and exploiting them even more. We don't hear much about that. And I think that has to be brought forward. That has to be acknowledged. That has to be seen. And we now applaud the resistance movement It is because of our anger and our anxiety about what's happening in India at large. But we should not forget that the real victims of what's happening in India are those down below, are the laboring classes. The 4 labor codes, which are now enacted, were pushed through as the farmer bills were pushed through. Where is the protest against that, against those labor codes, where the 80 hours, the 8-hour day, workday, which was the triumph of the working classes worldwide, has been substituted by declaring that now the working classes have to work for 12 hours at pitiable wages, called and dismissed according to the wishes of employers. Also these farmers who are now protesting. Let's balance the picture we are talking about even-handedly and still applaud what's happening in the rural economy today in the protest movement that is going on. Thank you, Jens, and all power to you and the other contributors.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks for opening up the discussion by posing this comment. And well, I could join too, but I will hand back to Vikas for his view and comments to this. Vikas, over to you.
Well, firstly, I don't know why there is no question that we should not be seeing these protests as, bringing about, the kind of agrarian transformation that we think India needs. And I have no doubt that, it is obviously the case that the struggle at the moment is not directly dealing with demands of agricultural workers, which are obviously far more grave than of many sections of peasantry who are part of the struggle. That said, I think we should not miss the point that this is after a very long time that India has had fairly large, in fact massive, protests by farmers over the last few years. The Long March in Maharashtra, the several massive protests in Delhi that have taken place in the last few years. What clearly differentiates those protests and what we are seeing today is that for the first time, rich peasantry has actually come in with the force that it has. That said, I do not think we should make the mistake of thinking that the protests right now are only rich peasants. They are not. In fact, as we talk, I and a group of my students, we have started doing a survey of farmers at the protest sites to get data about what these farmers are and so on. But and from what we have seen over the last few days, it is clear that you have a lot of middle peasants, but you also have a lot of small and poor peasants from Punjab and Haryana, but from a lot of other states. The southern borders, where Kisan Sabha is the largest contingent, comprises of a vast majority of poor peasants there. So it is not the case that poor sections of peasantry or in fact agricultural workers are not there at all. But it is in fact the case that for the first time in many years, you have rich peasantry joining in a big way. That said, these protests are happening on a very narrow set of demands. The demands are repealing of these laws and making MSP statutory. These are not about right to employment for workers or their wages, and there you are absolutely right that there are contradictions within the agrarian classes, of course. That said, there is a tactical point at this moment to forge a unity of agrarian classes on these limited set of demands. And I think that unity has, at this moment, huge relevance for Indian democracy. And I don't think one should underestimate the role this is playing. That said, I also want to mention that in the context of Punjab and Haryana, there is, I mean, one can look at it critically that when the rich peasants join a struggle of this kind, or lead a struggle of this kind, they are able to bring with them other agrarian classes. But when the protests are led by poor peasants and agricultural workers, the rich peasantry does not join in with the same spirit and force.
Right.
That is true. That said, one also has to understand, given the power of state that one is dealing with, there is no question that you couldn't have breached those barricades had it not been with the power of the rich peasants. If you did not have those massive tractors with those massive tractor trolleys and the kind of equipment they had to move those sand-filled trucks and concrete boulders, there's no way you could have done this. And
May
there
I
is no way that for 59 days you could sit on those borders, was it not for the fact that the entire Sikh community, with all the resources of the rich peasantry, was not providing support to it. So there is no doubt that that is there. But I think the whole point is that in the farm protests of peasant protests that we were seeing over the last few years, what was missing was the rich peasantry. And you now have a fairly large part of rich peasantry, particularly from Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP, which has joined in big time. So there is something there.
May I cut you short here? May I cut you short? Because I agree with all what you have said. I agree with that. But it is like this. When the Goods and Services Tax was introduced in 2016, when the employers then, the capitalist class in the informal economy, had gone on strike, they would have brought along the workers in the workshops, docile, underpaid, without decent conditions of employment, and they would have joined the strike if their masters had told them to do so. This is the parallel with what I'm seeing now. The rich peasantry taking along the weak-hearted classes in sympathy with them. For the moment, I think it is more important that the current set of power mongers is defeated in the struggle. For the moment, I think that is a priority. That Narendra Modi and Amit Shah cannot go away is pushing through their dictate in parliament like it has been done now. But this should not close our eyes to the ugliness also of the class distortions in the rural economy.
Sure, absolutely. No.
Thank you.
Now, before giving the word back to you, Vikas, I think it might be useful to just broaden out the comments from others, because I mean, and I myself would just like to say that this, of course, brings back memories of BKU in Uttar Pradesh in the 1990s, the alliance they managed to put together, which clearly represented farmers that had land, and was very strong leadership also of bigger farmers, but also where small farmers joined in because they would also benefit from the demands that were raised. To me, the tricky point is to what extent this alliance will go beyond in any meaningful ways those that have lands. And I guess that is a point that is similar to Jan's, but I can fully see why small farmers and even marginal farmers will join a movement such as this, because it is to their benefit as well to defeat these laws. and particularly, of course, in Punjab and elsewhere where you have access to the procurement system. But let me just, I wouldn't be surprised if, or I can see that Jonathan Paddington has his hand up, and given his past, his work, I wouldn't be surprised if he would ask a question along similar lines. So, Jonathan, is your question along these lines? Then please join in now.
Yeah, thanks, Jens. It is very much along those lines about the social basis of the movement. And I agree to a considerable extent with what Jan Bremen was just saying, and what you were just saying, indeed, about the BKU and the JATs in the late 80s, etc. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, new farmers' movements, those mass mobilizations that took place, were led by petty capital, led by the dominant caste, the Vokaligas and Lingayats in Karnataka, the Jats in the north, the Marathas in Maharashtra, etc. And there were no Dalits and there were no women, and Dalit laborers were told that they had to take part in protests, otherwise they would be barred from agricultural labor in certain places. So I'm very much in agreement with what Jan Bremen was saying when we look back at that earlier wave of mobilization. But I wonder, whilst I think that is the same to a large degree in the current mobilization, are there not signs of some organizations which are a little bit different, like the BKU Ekta Ugrahan, which is primarily based in the south of the Punjab, in the Malwa region of the Punjab, which I believe is it's less irrigated, it's a less wealthy, there are fewer capitalist farmers in that region. So are we actually seeing, and of course the majority of farmers are also laborers. That's a very important, I think, point to bear in mind here. You know, over 80% of farmers in India are also involved in wage labor. So are we actually seeing to some extent, an alliance potentially between those less well-off sections being involved in this? What are the kind of possible basis for involvement of less well-off sections of farmers? Is the PDS, because of course the PDS is on the line here, is that potentially something that could draw, if you like, the social groups in the middle together with the social groups lower down for once? I don't know, it's a question. Or is this actually, as Jan Bremen is indicating, and I would probably tend to agree, going to be a movement which is shaped ultimately by petty capital and larger capitalist farmers?
Again, before a reply, I would just ask Mohan Rao whether your comment question relate to these issues, or whether we should wait till a bit later with your comment question. You're on mute. I can't hear.
Yeah, we can wait until later because yeah, sure.
Yeah, good. So Vikas, over to you.
Well, I just have to say that, one is, yes, BKU Ugraha and various organizations of agricultural workers and Pendu Kisan Union, various and agricultural workers organizations are organizationally involved. So they are part of the Sanyukt Kisan Morcha, and they have been there. They are there as organizations, and they have done mobilization. Two things one has to note though. So one is that in Punjab in particular, or let's say three things to note. One is Punjab has a very specific socio-economic structure, where the inequalities are very high. There is a sort of sharp divide between the land owning castes and the Dalits, who are almost entirely landless. It's the state with highest proportion of Dalit castes which are landless. But there is also another aspect, which is that it's a state which is predominantly Sikh. And there is a very strong Sikh organization in Punjab. And this really distinguishes Punjab from Haryana. And the way mobilization has happened in Punjab is markedly different from the way mobilization has happened in Haryana. And one of the key differences is this, that there is this whole social religious organization of Gurudwaras in Punjab, which has been instrumental in mobilization. In Punjab today, the support for these protests is so deep that if you are anybody and if you've not expressed your support to this farmers protest, either by coming to borders of Delhi or by protesting in Punjab itself, or by publicly, creating songs or making speeches or doing something, you run the risk of being socially boycotted. There is that kind of groundswell in Punjab. I mean, Punjabi singers who sing, the most regressive film songs with all kinds of terrible things are today talking of Mazdoor Kisan Ekta, the unity of workers and peasants. They're singing songs about unity of workers and peasants. That's something. Uh, so the groundswell that is happened in Punjab is quite remarkable. Uh, about the participation of Dalits and landless workers in Punjab, uh, I think it is there. It's still marginal. Bulk of the people at Singhu and Tikri border, Singhu in particular, which is where the Punjab is concentrated, is Jat Sikh. Jat Sikhs are the vast majority of people there, of all kinds of land sizes. So there are also smaller and larger, but it's a lot of it is Jat Sikh mobilization. There are some Dalits and agricultural workers there as well. They are there more organization in terms of their organizational presence and participation than in terms of number of people that have actually come there. And it clearly reflects the fact that the demands on which this battle is being fought are really demands of farmers and not demands of agricultural workers. So you do see significantly greater, and in fact predominantly a farmer. This is a farmer struggle. It's a struggle which is being supported by organization of agricultural workers, but agricultural workers are not there in the same kind of numbers as farmers are. So that's the scenario at the moment. In particular, if you look at mobilizations from Punjab and Haryana are concerned, but I mean there is a difference elsewhere. For example, Rajasthan or Maharashtra, where Kisan Sabha has its base among, in Maharashtra, for example, the base is among Adivasis and the indigenous tribes. And bulk of the mobilization is of people who are poor peasants, workers, people who migrate, the migrant labor that Jan has worked for decades on. A lot of those people are at the southern border protesting. So it really reflects the character of organizations that have mobilized. BKU is the biggest mobilizer in Punjab and Haryana, but All India Kisan Sabha is really the organization that has given it the All India character. The mobilization from other states, not at the same level, same scale as Punjab and Haryana, but put together very substantial. And it's the All India Kisan Sabha which has brought the national character to the struggle. And their support comes actually from predominantly from small and middle peasantry and agricultural workers in case of All India Agricultural Workers Union. So it's really, that's the kind of scenario. So I would say it's a mixed situation. I mean, and therefore I think one has to take what it is in terms of its potential. It has a certain potential to bring about to get some to achieve something, and I don't think one should overstate it. I mean, I don't think, I don't see this as having a fundamentally transformatory potential. The unity of peasant organizations is on a limited agenda. I don't think they would agree on anything beyond this limited agenda. So all of that has to be kept in mind.
Fine, thank you. So this now I would like to just hand over to my two co-hosts, Shreya and Enrique, because they are monitoring the chats that we have, and so that they can report on the questions on the chat. Sadly, Shreya has a computer problem, so and she would also have had issues that she would have liked to have raised herself. So she's incapable of doing that right now. But Enrique, I think you have been monitoring the chats as well. So would you mind putting some of the questions to us now?
Sure, Jens. No problem with that. Well, some of the questions are also related to what is already been discussed, the issue of cross-class alliances and the rest. But here's one, I think it's from Charlotte Spring. So she's asking in terms of solidarity, how far do these protests express solidarity across religious and ethnic divides? So that's one question. We have another one by Rina Bahaiti. She asked, are there any signs or do you foresee that the protests can be is going to spread internationally or is going to influence other movements and in other sectors if there is sort of potential that this could be become bigger in other areas as well?
Yeah. Let's take those ones because there are a fair few, but let's take those ones for now and then return again in a minute. Yeah.
Well, one is in India, protests are happening everywhere. Practically every state has had protests. So protests are not only concentrated in Delhi. The biggest ones are happening in Delhi, and they're obviously the most significant in terms of putting pressure on the central government. But protests are happening in all the other states, in all the major states. I think these protests are important in many, many ways. One is that they have broken the jinx. I mean, we had massive protests on the Citizenship Amendment Act happening before the pandemic struck. And then everything was crushed and you thought it was all over. And then the farmers come in much bigger force. So this is really sort of, everybody in some sense, those who were, fighting for this government have suddenly, have a sigh of relief that, okay, we are back on track. So I mean, in that respect, I think I think these protests are extremely important from that perspective. In terms of what they would achieve in dealing with agrarian problems, I think one has to have a balanced view about it. One shouldn't go overboard. I think if these protests can manage to achieve what is being demanded, the repeal of 3 laws and some move towards making agriculture remunerative, a statutory right to remunerative agriculture, I think that would be a huge achievement. And if they can achieve that, that's a big deal. So that internationally, I don't know what it would mean internationally, but the other thing it has done is it has shown us new ways, new forms of protests, and we've not had in terms of sheer forms of how to protest. I mean, this is very different. About the ethnic divides, well, ethnic divides have not been out in the open. It's a peculiar thing. You see, insofar as Punjab and Haryana, in fact, even Haryana, the protests are being led by Sikhs, which is very different from, for example, the CAA protests, where the Muslims were at the receiving end of it and were the dominant protesting force. And with all the demonization of Muslims that has been done, it was very easy to turn the ultra right-wing Hindus against them, to do riots and then to crush it. It's much more complicated when it comes to farmers. It's much more complicated when it comes to Sikhs. So the use of force is something that the state would be very wary of. I mean, what they did on November 26th was already a big problem for them. It's become a fiasco, and it's going to be difficult for the government to just use force. They have been trying to brand them as anti-national and Khalistanis and all of that. But and there have been attempts at using the the national the stringent criminal laws against some of the activists. But those things are, use of force is going to be more difficult in this context than it has been, because it's not a community that has already been demonized. So it's difficult for the state to do it. But yeah. And the other thing that has happened is that the farmers have been very strongly working towards building solidarities across states and class solidarity. So the slogan is unity of farmers and workers, whatever it means. I mean, one shouldn't take it that they're necessarily going to take the issues of the workers along with the issues of the farmers, but at least the slogan that's being raised is one where all the working classes have to unite. It's interesting. I mean, if at least the various sections of peasantry, including rich peasantry, starts giving that slogan. The other is the solidarity is being forced across farmers from different states and refusing to allow divisive issues to be raised. So, for example, the government tried to raise the issue of conflicts over river waters between Haryana and Punjab. And the farmers were really, they came down very heavily on that, we are not going to be divided on issues such as this. In fact, the common sort of answer to that was that if this government is going to bring laws such as these, which would result in alienation from land, what are we going to do with water? So first, let's preserve our lands, let's save our lands, and then we'll worry about our battles over water. So the government has been trying to divide, has been trying to use divisive tactics, but the farmers have been working overtime to bring to strengthen solidarity. So that's been one aspect of this battle.
Thank you. Let us go to Mohan Rao's question now. Mohan Rao.
Thank you, Jens, and thanks to Vikas, to Jan Bremen and others for your very illuminating, even if short, discussion of what I like to think about as the question of class for itself, or classes for themselves, dimension of what's going on in India right now. I'd just like to add a small kind of footnote, which is that while we can, of course, and we ought to debate the unity or otherwise internally of the agrarian classes, it is clearly notable that the judiciary and the executive and, of course, the central legislature are entirely in the pockets of one particular class. We all know what that is. That's the bourgeoisie, which is completely absent from any notion of the agrarian classes. So let's not forget that angle. So this is a class struggle by whatever reckoning. The question that I wanted to raise, which I've actually raised in my in the chat, is that in some ways, as I see it, when it comes to the question of class in itself or classes in themselves question, the MSP has been a leading element. In many ways, the economic interests that are arrayed in this struggle, really the focal point is the MSP. And my question is, and perhaps Vikas or somebody else can throw some light on this, is given the relatively small proportions of the population, of the farming population who actually are able to sell at MSP, given the relatively small coverage in terms of regions, crops, etc., can one make a strong, perhaps even a powerful case that the MSP is really relevant for many, many farming communities across the country because it provides a lead element in the marketplace. So when the MSP goes up, all the other prices willy-nilly, sympathetically move up. Now, how far, how much, to be debated, but that influence is there. I think probably is where I would begin. But I'd like to know your views. Thank you.
Hi, Bon. I actually don't think so. Two things. Firstly, I think this point about MSP benefiting very few farmers, and maybe correct in concept sort of on the whole, but very often a number that is quoted, 6% of farmers getting benefit of MSP, which comes from the situation assessment survey, is a wrong number. That the way that question was posed in that questionnaire cannot actually be used to come out with this number. This number was put out in the Shantakumar committee report, and I think this number is understated because of the way that survey captured this. This question was canvassed in that survey. At the moment, about 1/3 of rice and wheat are procured by the government. Of the total production, about 1/3 of rice and wheat are procured by the government, which is not a small amount. We don't have what percent of farmers does that mean, but in terms of quantity, it's about 1/3. I think MSP, now coming to your question about the role MSP plays, I think for crops other than rice and wheat, MSP is practically irrelevant. Since there is no procurement, it really makes no difference what government announces. The prices are determined by other things. They're determined by demand and supply. They're determined by the international trade in cases of oilseeds and pulses. They are determined by cartelization and collusion by traders, and so on and so forth. So I do not think that MSP really plays a significant role. MSP, in fact, in case of rice and wheat, in my view, over the last few years, has been playing a perverse role. A point that was the earliest reference to which I've seen in Krishna Bharadwaj's writings, that you now have a situation where MSP is significantly higher than the open market price. MSP is the only price that gives some income to farmers, producers of rice and wheat, which means that in states such as Haryana, Punjab, but also Madhya Pradesh, in case of rice in Chhattisgarh, and in several other states, there is greater pressure from below for procurement. And because in many states, the procurement is actually done by state level agencies, either as part of the centralized system in Punjab and Haryana, the state governments do it, or as part of decentralized system in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, where the state level agencies are now tasked with procurement. The procurement happens because of this pressure from below. Now, as a result, as I have shown, there has been a greater procurement, but government is unable to dispose of grain, which means that the government is accumulating more and more grain. Massive mountains of grain are lying with the government, which has meant that it actually puts a downward pressure on open market prices. Traders in Bihar and West Bengal bring down their prices because they know sooner or later the grain in the granaries of Food Corporation of India is going to come out in the open market. And so farmers who do not have the facility of being able to sell it to the government are actually at the receiving end and are actually now facing a problem because the prices are just too low. So I think not only MSP does not play a leading role in sort of pushing up the open market prices. In case of rice and wheat, it's perhaps doing exactly the opposite. That the open market, and it's quite incredible. Over this year, during the pandemic, India has exported massive quantities of rice and non-basmati rice, not just basmati rice. So non-basmati rice exports have swelled up because these traders are buying the grain cheap. And Indian rice is cheaper than the Thai rice and Vietnamese rice and so on. So it's actually the whole political economy is quite different. But I think the question that needs to be asked is that, well, if a large majority of farmers are not able to get remunerative prices, the government support in terms of ensuring that they get agriculture becomes remunerative for them has to be done. I am not really personally convinced that making MSP statutory in the present situation is feasible. I actually, MSP could be made statutory if the systems of public support and subsidies were of the kind that we had in the 1990s, where fertilizers were the prices of fertilizers were controlled, prices of various other seeds were provided by the government, seed prices were not so high, diesel prices were controlled, and so on and so forth, resulting in a situation that cost of production was much lower, and MSP was not very high, very much higher than the open market prices. In fact, in most years, MSP would be marginally less than the open market price. But agriculture would be remunerative because input prices were kept low. That, to me, is actually the way to go. And if you were able to keep the cost of production low and bring some parity between the open market price and the MSP, then you could make MSP a statutory right and use MSP to, on the margin, to ensure that farmers get incomes from agriculture, get minimum incomes from agriculture. So making MSP statutory is only possible if MSP is not too much higher than the open market. In fact, should be close to the open market price, and that can only happen if you can bring input prices down.
Okay, thanks. Let us go back to the chat where Judith Hayer has posted a set of questions for Barbara Harris-White, who were unable to post, I think, herself. Enrique, do you want to take them, or shall I? Or
sorry, yeah.
Enrique, will you read them, or I can read them? So the questions that Judith has posted on behalf of Barbara are 3 questions. 1, have the farmers laid siege to Delhi's food supply? How is the capital provisioning itself? That's the 1 question. Second one is, I read today that the government has agreed to hold the laws for 1.5 years. What does that mean? That was the second question. Third question, another kind of politics is going on simultaneously, led by FIC, CII, Association, so employers organizations. What are the configurations of power against the farm protests? Several farmers associations are for the reforms. So these are the questions she put, but let me also read aloud Adam Javid that followed on and saying, how has middle-class Delhi reacted, and what kind of politics coalitions are in play for the urban consumer? My own family in East Delhi, Noida, has largely ignored this. They find it amusing, even as they buy their organic produce from a Delhi equivalent of CSA. This is their middle-class privilege. But as we wade through the class character of the protests, this question is also on my mind. So, Vikas, 3 questions and a comment for you.
Okay, so you see, Delhi is a very porous city. There are many entry points. So even with blocking 6 major entry points into Delhi, Delhi has not, it's not really, you've not blocked all entry points. There are many more entry points. So the food supply is not stopped. And in fact, I mean, there was a sort of increase in food prices, but that's not really happened so far. You see, the protests at Singhu border are not too far away from Azadpur Mandi. It'll take them 15 minutes to come in front of Azadpur Mandi. If they come in front of Azadpur Mandi, we are finished. Then the agriculture supply is hit. So as of now, there is no plan to come into the outer ring road, which means that farmers are not planning to block the Azadpur Mandi. But if, on 26th, that artery is blocked, things could get difficult. So this has been on everybody's mind. that would this happen, and if this happens, that would obviously put pressure on the government. But as of now, no. About government offering to hold the laws for 1.5 years, I don't think it means very much. They are saying they would hold implementation of the laws. The laws remain in place. That's obviously a tactic designed to dissipate the protests, and then when the situation is convenient, you implement the laws, or you implement the laws in stages, and so on. So that obviously the farmers have refused to buy. About FICCI, CII, etc., I do know that FICCI, CII, etc., were very much behind these laws. In fact, FICCI, CII for a long time have been arguing for use of this entry 33 of the 7th schedule of the concurrent list of the 7th schedule, and urging the central government to enact some of these laws. This has been their position for a fairly long time. So the fact that the government has actually done it clearly reflects that they've bought that argument. So this argument has been an argument of FICCI and CII for a long time, and therefore there is no doubt that they are behind the laws. What what is the how much power they have over the government to resist these protests? One has to see, how much can they do. But a lot of it is also the fact that the present government and the head of this government is a person who doesn't like to be seen to step back. So you announce demonetization, and then you realize it's a stupidity, but then you never accept it. You announce a lockdown when India has just 500 cases of COVID, and you create a massive crisis by announcing it at a notice of 4 hours, and you never accept that you did something stupid. So that's the nature of government and the prime minister we have. Whether it's just that ego which is holding back the government from withdrawing, or there are still CIIs and FICCI are fighting back, and Ambanis and Adanis are fighting back, we don't know. About the middle classes of Delhi, I would say two things. One, the Sikh middle class, which is a fairly substantial part of Delhi's population, has been very active. Both the Sikh organizations of Delhi and individuals. You go to Singhu border, there's huge number of people visiting Singhu border, but a lot of them, of course, are daily visitors from Punjab and Haryana, but there are also people visiting from Delhi. But I must also say that this is also a cause of huge pain among protesting farmers, and so in fact, day before yesterday, I was at Singhu border, and a farmer from Kurukshetra caught hold of me and started asking who I was, and we started talking, and he said, look, we know how terrible the mainstream media of this country is. We know what this government is. We have no hopes from the judiciary. But what has happened to people of Delhi? Why aren't there some people who have a conscience in Delhi? Why aren't they coming here in solidarity? So there is that aspect. Part of it is still because in Delhi, a lot of people who would otherwise be participating in such protests are not coming out of their homes because of the fear of COVID. That is very much there. But then there is also the apathy of middle classes. So it's a combination of all of this. But there is certainly that element that the middle classes and the elite of Delhi have not expressed their solidarity or gone there in the same way that they should have. But that's how they are.
Okay, well, we are getting closer to the end, sadly, of this two hour event, but we still have some questions, and I will now ask Prachi Gago to put her question.
Hello, sir. Um, Actually, my question has been a bit answered, but I would still like to ask it. As we have seen, this government has ruled over like two tenures now, the first, and also they won the second one. And all of their acts, their rules and regulations, all have failed in the country so far. But why do you think the government is still so vulnerable to put these acts, which works against the population of the country?
Yeah, because
Well, I think they were simply working at the behest of big corporates. The, I mean, I have no doubt that the big corporates were behind this, and the speed with which they were brought in the month of May, as I said, they were still trying to get the state governments to amend their acts, and then suddenly, in a matter of days, a whole set of new laws are put in place. So the speed with which it was done, there is no doubt that the big the corporate sector was pushing for it, and they got the government to do it. So there is no doubt that that was behind it. And I mean, it's not a government that is a government of people. So I mean, why is this government, despite having such a majority in the parliament, not doing what people perhaps voted them for? Because that's the character of this government.
Great.
so we have more questions from the chat as well, and some that relates to this. Enrique, would you raise some of these questions?
Sure. Yeah, there are a couple of questions in terms of the role of external financial institutions, the IMF and the World Trade Organization. So the question is if they have played any role in this entire problematic. So that's one. And the other one is if there's an effect of the coronavirus on the protest, if this is an issue and it's a factor that needs to be considered there.
Well, the fact that India's public procurement and subsidies for agriculture have been contested all the time in WTO has clearly been a factor. I mean, it's people who've been arguing for these reforms have constantly, talked about how, because of India's obligations in WTO, these reforms are required, and how system of public procurement, etc., should be cut down or be over time substituted with things like direct benefit transfer and cash transfers and so on, has been the undercurrent throughout. So it's very much part of that narrative. Uh, we don't know whether there's been any explicit sort of pressures from organizations such as World Bank or IMF. But clearly, I mean, the fact that India's support to agriculture is seen to be violating the provisions of WTO has very much been, a part of that narrative. So that, yes. About effect of COVID on the protest, I don't know. I think the all signs are that we've achieved herd immunity. I mean, the kind of protests, and nobody is wearing masks on those protests. Nobody is following any precautions in those protests. And, I mean, it must be that. I mean, we've just had far more infections than the government admits. In fact, I am also of the view that India has had many more deaths than are counted in the official statistics. So we've perhaps gone far beyond than what is being seen, and we have perhaps uh, you know achieved, at least in some sections of population in certain areas, a kind of a herd immunity, because these farmers are there and they've basically overcome completely the fear of COVID. I mean, they're like I mean, they'll laugh at you if you talked about COVID in those protests. So that's how it is. In fact, it's quite strange. And when we've gone there, we've kept our masks on, and we are really we stand out because nobody is wearing them. And there's this one guy, and it's clear that this person's come from Delhi, and he's one of those, and they're wearing masks, and that's how it is.
Thank you, Vikas. And there are still questions coming in, but I think we have to draw this to a close soon. Let me just ask Shreya, who I think is online again, if there are any questions that we have missed from the YouTube online chat.
No, Jens. I think there's nothing. I think there's one by Swati Birla which talks about you differentiate two political periods between 2003 and 14 and 2014 and 20, and started to develop an argument on the shift in economy and politics within center and between central and regional forces. I'm curious to hear you develop that further. But I think apart from that.
Yeah, I was only saying that the UPA period, the period between 2004 and 2014, with all its problems. I'm no great fan of what happened in during those periods. I mean, a lot of what happened during that period. But that said, on this issue, there is a clear difference between the aggressiveness with which BJP governments have pursued these reforms and the way Congress governments pursued these reforms. And there is no doubt that in never have the Congress governments accepted to sort of done anything of this kind where national laws would be brought. Central government would enact laws such as these at the national level, not in the pertaining to agriculture. So that difference, whatever it's worth, is there. I mean, during the UPA government between 2004 and 2014, also, I mean, all sorts of things were done, where a lot of these reforms at the state level were done by governments which were Congress governments. So there's not to say that Congress is less committed to the agenda of liberalization of in agriculture, but just to say that on this question, on this specific question, even when they were ideologically committed to this direction of change, possibly because of the fear of popular resistance, they never went to this extent as this government has.
Thank you. And I think with this, we will draw this to a close. Let me just highlight that Ramakumar has posted on the chat an article, a link to an article on IMF on the farm laws. But apart from that, let me thank you, Vikas, for spending your late evening on presenting and discussing here. And of course, all the work you put into this as well. I thought it was absolutely fascinating and brilliant and interesting. And we just hope the best for that. Whatever one thinks of the class character, we all know who the enemy is here, and one can only hope for the best. Now, let me also thank everyone that have taken part and has been here from wherever in the world at whatever time of the day or nights that they have managed to set aside for this, and thanks for the lively discussion and debate we've had here. So for me, there's only left to also thank my co-hosts and to say that our next Agrarian Change webinar is in late February, 25th of February, where Haroon Akram Lodi from Trent University in Ontario will talk on the gender gap in agricultural productivity in Eastern and Southern Africa, quantitative and qualitative determinants. So we're moving to a slightly different topic, but hopefully still a fascinating debate and discussion. But thanks, Vikas, and thanks everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jens, and thanks everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, just give you Thanks.
Am
Yeah.
I good to end the call then?
Yes, and Vikas and Enrique will catch up in a different forum. Thank you. Thanks, Vikas.
Because I just sent you the email, so we can meet in 10 minutes, if that's fine.
Sure.